The theories in the last chunk on socio-psychological research all have some things in common, as you probably noticed. They're all driven, for example, by this notion that we are the way we are. Our traits are formed because we were born that way. It's part of our DNA. We're shy because we were born that way. We are outgoing because we were born that way. We're argumentative because we were born that way, etc. And that is a very fixed view of the communicator. The sociocultural tradition, in contrast, has a much more fluid view of who we are and how we become that way. Presentational self is a theory, an area that describes our self, that's the word they use, not our personality, in terms of a theatrical metaphor. In other words, we present ourselves or perform our identity as if we were on a stage. So that's why it has presentational self. When we show up at a different setting, we play a role. The word role there, for example, goes along with that theatrical metaphor. We are actors who want to manage the impression that we give our, quote, audience in each situation. And you actually have probably found yourself doing this. Let's say you're interacting with your friends. You might talk in a different way to fit in with that group. You might hold certain opinions back. You might express others. And then when you're with your parents, you might act a little differently. And you might not feel 100% different, like I'm a different person around my friends than I am with my parents. But you will choose to talk about different things, and you'll act a little different around your parents. Sometimes you'll feel those worlds colliding because when your parents are in the same place, especially when you're younger, by the way, junior high and high school, when your parents are in the same place as a group of your friends, you have this sense of embarrassment and you have this sense of confusion over who you are and how others are seeing you, because you're on stage, right, and you're being evaluated. And so that presentational self really is a lot about how we are engaging in these interactions to play a certain role, to create a certain impression. So third bullet there, we engage in interactions such as having lunch or making small talk, and we also are trying to create a desired impression. So we're having lunch in a certain way, we're doing small talk in a certain way, but we're also trying to come across as, for example, someone that might be good to hire, or someone that would be a good match for someone's daughter. So we're not just there exchanging information, we're there playing a role. We're trying to come across in a certain way. Things like a first date are really obvious examples of this. Sure, you're having dinner, right? But you're also trying to make a particular kind of impression. You're presenting a certain side of yourself. A job interview is very similar. You're trying to create a certain impression. You're presenting yourself in a certain way. And it often will, in those most obvious moments, it'll feel a little bit like acting. So there's presentational self, and you'll notice it's very different. It's not about how you were born or your DNA. It's about how the context, the situation, the environment is one of the main factors in how we show up. You know, how our self or identity gets presented. Symbolic interactionism is a very confusing, ambiguous area for a lot of students. I'll do my best to make it clear. Symbolic interactionism is about how people interact with others, and over time they begin to share the meanings that they have for certain words and actions, and thus come to understand events in a particular way. So maybe you're in a small group of friends that you have grown up with, and over time you interact with them and you start to understand, you share a language, you share a sense of reality because of your conversations, and the way those other people see you and the way you see them shapes who you are, shapes how you see yourself. We have what we call social objects, and that can be any object. Could be a particular, maybe like a video game that you play together with your friends, or a car that you hang out with, in with your friends. Those become social objects. In other words, they take on a kind of meaning. They're not just inanimate objects that don't mean anything. They start to mean things to you. I remember there was a famous pop star, Justin Bieber, I believe it was, and he touched the Stanley Cup. He was in the locker room or somewhere where the sports team, the hockey team, had the Stanley Cup, and you're not supposed to touch the Stanley Cup. If you are not the hockey team that won the Stanley Cup, you are not supposed to put your hands all over it. And I guess he didn't know the norms and he didn't know the rules about that, and so he touched the Stanley Cup. And people got a little bit bent out of shape about it, especially people who were annoyed with him in the first place for whatever reason. And so the Stanley Cup is a social object. It's not just a medal. It's not just a trophy that doesn't mean anything. There's meaning, right? We become socialized to understand what it means in a certain way, especially if you're a hockey team, especially if you're a devout hockey fan. And so people in the hockey community got really upset about that. So a social object can be really any object that becomes significant or meaningful to us, and it does so by the way we interact with other people and discuss it. We also have orientational others. Orientational others are the people in our lives that we orient ourselves to, or in other words, that we keep in mind as we're interacting. Have you ever had one of those moments, for example, where you thought to yourself, oh my gosh, if my mother ever saw me right now, here's what she would think about this. And so in your mind, you have a person, a specific person that you are orienting to in your mind, and it's shaping how you see yourself. That's why we use this word self so often, because it's not necessarily about how you were born, but how you're interacting, and how you're interacting with other people and how their view of you shapes your view of you. And that's why we use this term self, because it's all about how the person is shaped. So you talk about myself, here's what I think I am. Let me tell you about myself. And we're talking about who we are in our minds. We're not talking necessarily about our DNA. So this is the symbolic interactionism. A little vague and ambiguous in terms of the language. Hopefully the examples will help make it more concrete. Identity negotiation theory, again, is similar to some of these others that we just talked about, but it's all about how we navigate our interactions with other people and form our identities. The word identity here is a corresponding term to how the trait crowd uses the term personality. Usually the term self and identity go together, because identity is this notion of this is how you identify yourself, whereas personality is not necessarily something that you call yourself. In fact, you might take a personality test, and the test tells you what kind of personality you have, whereas identity and self are self-description. It's the way you see the way you see who you are. So our identities are created over time through social interaction. That sounds familiar because it's in this tradition. We just discussed a couple of theories that indicate that. Identity is not the same as personality. Identity is more public, more performed, and personality is more genetically determined. And in contrast, our identities emerge when we assess, modify, or challenge our own and others' self-identifications. So as we interact with other people, we start to get shaped in specific ways, and that might change or modify who we are. Our personality here is not something that is fixed. In fact, they don't even use this word. It's much more fluid. There are many ways that we see this, many overlapping circles. For example, your personal identity, and that is how you view yourself. Your social identity, and that is as you're interacting with other people and friends and people around you, you are starting to get shaped at that level as well. And you have your cultural identity. You maybe come from a certain culture. Maybe the ancestors, the people in your family, have a very specific cultural or religious background, and that shapes how you see yourself. That's another layer. Part of that might be your ethnic identity, and that is, I'm Polish. I'm half Polish, And being Polish has never been, I don't think that's ever been a central part of how I see myself. But for some people, their background, their ethnic background, really does influence the way they see themselves. I identify very closely with it. And so these are the ways that the overlapping circles, or maybe personal identity is the most specific, then social, then cultural, and as part of that is ethnic. And those are layers, if you will, of how we see ourselves and how we identify. So let's talk a little bit about the critical tradition. The critical tradition is not one of the main two that we will discuss, but it does offer an important add-on, if you will. It's not a dominant part of this chapter, but an important add-on in terms of the communicator. And we'll talk specifically about standpoint theory. Standpoint theory is a very interesting theory in terms of it integrates power into our perspective of the world. And so standpoint theory explains that the circumstances of our life or our place in society, that is your standpoint, influences how we see the world. People in historically marginalized groups, that means people who are pushed to the margins of the page, for example, as an illustration, the margins of a page are very, that's the outer area, not the central part. For example, women, people of color, etc., view power relationships and the existing social order from a very different standpoint than other people. For example, people in high power positions don't see the world the same way at all. They learn to see the world from multiple viewpoints to survive, whereas already powerful individuals do not need to view things from another perspective to get their needs met. So let's pretend you are working in a very fancy restaurant and you are a busser. Yeah, I used to do this job. I worked in an extremely fancy restaurant, a restaurant that I could not personally afford to eat at if I were just a regular customer, but I was bussing tables. And I saw the world very differently than some of the extremely wealthy customers that came in there. Right? I had to see the world from at least two different points. I had to see it from my position as a server, and I had to literally put myself in the customer's position to know how to better serve them. So I had to view things from a variety of standpoints, so to speak. My primary standpoint, of course, is that I am a server and I'm in a serving position, and so that's how I see it. But to do a good job and to please the customer, I have to understand, well, what does this customer want? What are they expecting from me? How can I fit their expectations? Now, that very wealthy customer is not in the same situation. He or she does not have to put themselves in my position as a busser to get on with the interaction. They don't need to put themselves in my place to survive, but I do. And so my standpoint of that power dynamic is very different. And by the way, ever since then, every time I go anywhere to eat or anywhere where there's any kind of server, I'm always very supportive and friendly. I'm a pretty good tipper, and I make sure that they know that I respect them. I have heard, though, horror stories, of course, from servers and seen some horror stories myself where people in very high positions of power treat people in low positions of power very poorly because they can get away with it. Not because they want to be that way, but because it doesn't affect them really negatively if they do. Now, if I'm a server and I treat someone badly, it affects my life. I'm going to get fired. So the standpoint theory is an interesting one, and they're basically saying, hey, the people that are marginalized, that are not in positions of power, understand things about power dynamic and the social order that people in very privileged positions don't understand because they haven't necessarily been there themselves. That's why a lot of times people, leaders, high up leaders, especially those coming out of Ivy League schools and whatnot and coming from wealthy backgrounds, a lot of those leaders, when they become high up leaders, maybe even the top dog, they get accused of being out of touch because they don't understand the, quote, common man. They don't understand what everyday struggles look like. There was a famous author, a famous politician, I'm not going to mention names, that talked about how he or she was broke and because they had some outstanding legal debts, but the more people looked into it, they said, wait a minute, you were broke? You signed a $10 million book deal that year. How broke could you be? But see, it's all perspective, right? To them, that's broke. To have legal debts and to sign a $10 million book deal the same year, it's fine. It's totally legit to say they're broke because they're comparing it to the way their life normally was. Here's another example. There's another politician from a different party, and he or she, I'll try to be neutral, he or she was asked about how much money he or she made, and there's a little bit of a comment. The person said, I get speaking fees from time to time, but not very much. Now, if I were to ask you what not very much money is, your answer probably would be very different than this person's answer because they only gave 9 speaking engagements the previous year, and for 9 hour-long speaking engagements, they made $374,000, and they consider that not very much. I'm willing to bet that just those speaking fees alone would put this particular person in the top 1 or 2% of income earners in the nation. But when you looked at their finances, they actually were multimillionaires. And so from their standpoint, that's not very much. But it just sounded a little tone deaf to the common person because most people are not in this position where, first of all, they get paid to show up and talk. And second of all, they're getting almost $400,000 for about 9 hours worth of work, which is incredible. So standpoint theory adds a very interesting dynamic to this idea of the communicator, and that is communicators aren't just a personality, or they're not just a self, but also each individual, each communicator exists in a social position which gives them a particular kind of view or standpoint through which they view power relationships, through which they view the existing social order.